Hi, it's Alex from Last Climb, and I will examine the Everest climb, where a gym influencer's ego became the deadliest thing on the mountain. Years of obsession with his body fed an arrogance that convinced him the world's greatest peak could be muscled through. But what ended up happening above 29,000 feet disturbed me more than any climb I've covered on this channel. It was April 9th, 2023, and the morning air over Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu carried a yellow haze of pollution and diesel fumes that blurred the Himalayan skyline into a smudge of white and gray. Temperatures hovered in the mid-60s, warm and thick compared to the altitudes waiting to the northeast. Taxi horns competed with motorcycle engines beyond the terminal, and the smell of exhaust mixed with incense from a street-side shrine near the arrivals gate. Among the climbers moving through customs that morning was Cade Moreau, a 27-year-old from San Diego, California. Cade stood, 6'1", and carried the kind of physique that performed well on camera. Wide shoulders, visible abdominals, the sculpted product of 5 years training 6 days a week in Southern California gyms. His TikTok following had climbed past 11,000, built on shirtless training clips, physique updates, and motivational captions delivered in the language of relentless self-improvement. His bio described him as an athlete, content creator, and adrenaline addict. The last label was the most honest. From every bit of info I gathered, apparently people who knew Cade described a pattern that had defined him since his early 20s. He cycled through obsessions with an intensity that consumed hobbies the way fire moved through dry brush. Skateboarding, then motocross, then open water swimming, then obstacle course racing. Each pursued with total commitment until the novelty faded and the next fixation replaced it. The gym lasted longest because it offered daily, visible feedback. And as someone who's into fitness, I get that. But I think this is where the relatability will end for me. Because by late 2021, even that felt insufficient. Cade told friends he needed something bigger, something that couldn't be contained inside a building with air conditioning and mirrors. He discovered mountaineering through a TikTok account run by a 32-year-old climber from Colorado, who documented high-altitude expeditions with cinematic footage and polished editing. The account had over 200,000 followers, and its creator had summited peaks across 3 continents over more than a decade of serious climbing. Cade consumed every video in the archive across a single weekend. And I want you to let that sink in. He just watched a couple videos online and decided he could do the same thing. Within a month, he had signed up for a guided climb of Mount Whitney, completed it without difficulty, and treated the summit photo as confirmation that his conditioning translated directly to mountaineering. Over the following 14 months, he added Kilimanjaro and Elbrus, both non-technical routes that rewarded endurance over skill. His content shifted accordingly. Mountain footage began to dominate, with summit photos and training montages captioned with references to Everest as his ultimate goal. And I want you to stay with me on this one, but he told friends Everest was just a bigger version of what he had already done. When one friend, a recreational climber with Cascades experience, pointed out that an 8,000-meter peak bore no resemblance to guided treks on Kilimanjaro, Cade laughed and said the friend sounded like someone who had never tried anything hard enough to be scared by it. The comment ended the friendship. That alone told me everything about where his head was at. It also captured something essential about how Cade processed risk. He had never encountered a challenge his body could not power through, and this unbroken record had calcified into a belief that willpower could substitute for the technical knowledge and altitude experience he did not possess. He booked his expedition in January 2023, paying $65,000 to a mid-tier commercial operator that accepted clients with limited high-altitude credentials. His mother called after seeing the announcement he posted on TikTok, a 30-second video of himself packing gear with a caption promising he would be standing on top of the world soon. The call was brief. She told him calmly but seriously that if he would listen to her, he would never go near that mountain. She told him one mistake at those altitudes could change everything. Cade told her she was worrying about nothing. He said he had watched dozens of people summit Everest online, and that most of them looked far less prepared than he was. The call ended with his mother asking him to be careful, and Cade assuring her it would be easy. And I want you to remember that, because it comes back around. He arrived at Everest Base Camp on April 15th after a 6-day trek from Lukla. The camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet, a temporary city of tents, solar panels, and satellite dishes clustered by expedition company. Prayer flags stretched between rock cairns, their fabric shredded by seasons of UV and wind. The scale of the mountain above was difficult to process, a wall of ice and rock rising another 11,000 vertical feet through zones of increasing hostility. I think most people can't even fully grasp what that looks like in person until they're standing under it. His expedition company assigned him a lead climbing Sherpa named Kancha Bhote, a 41-year-old from the Solukhumbu district with 8 Everest summits across 18 years of guiding. Kancha was quieter than most climbing Sherpas, known for an economy of words that made each statement land with weight. He had guided clients through summit pushes in whiteout conditions, managed death zone evacuations, and lost 2 close friends to serac collapses in the Khumbu icefall, which honestly just breaks my heart at how common it is for Sherpas. His reputation among operators was built on a single quality. He brought clients home alive, even when they made decisions that should have killed them. Kancha recognized the type within 48 hours. The most dangerous clients were never the weak or the frightened. The frightened listened. The weak turned back. The dangerous ones were the strong and confident, climbers whose physical ability convinced them the mountain operated on rules they could overpower. Cade confirmed the assessment almost immediately. From everything I gathered during the research, Kancha saw exactly where this was heading. While other climbers attended briefings on route conditions and emergency protocols, Cade filmed content. He recorded TikToks of himself doing pull-ups on a boulder near camp, flexing against the icefall backdrop, delivering monologues about mental toughness into his phone. When the acclimatization schedule was described, climbing high and sleeping low over several weeks, Cade asked publicly how the timeline could be compressed. When Kancha explained that acclimatization could not be rushed, that the body required weeks to produce additional red blood cells and adapt to reduced oxygen, Cade responded that his cardiovascular conditioning would compensate. He referenced his resting heart rate as if that number meant anything at 26,000 feet. And bear with me here, because every one of these moments is a domino. The first rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet revealed what gym fitness could not do. Cade moved through the icefall quickly, his raw strength allowing him to haul across ladder bridges with less effort than most clients. But above Camp 1, the altitude began its work. Headaches started the first night. Dizziness arrived the following morning. These were standard acclimatization. As symptoms, the correct response was patience, hydration, time. Cade's response was irritation. He pushed to climb higher ahead of schedule. Kancha refused, explaining that dismissing early altitude sickness was how treatable conditions became fatal ones. Cade spent the evening recording a video describing the headaches as proof he was pushing limits other climbers respected too much. He repackaged a warning sign as content. That's the part that gets me. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at 21,200 feet on schedule, despite Cade's repeated requests to accelerate. At Camp 2, Cade observed other clients using supplemental oxygen during rest periods, standard practice to improve recovery and preserve cognitive function at altitude. Cade filmed himself refusing a bottle offered by Kancha, narrating into his camera that he intended to climb without supplemental oxygen. He described the approach as doing it raw, framing what was medically reckless as superior toughness. The video performed, well, comments praised his determination. None of the commenters understood that refusing oxygen at those altitudes degraded judgment, coordination, and the body's ability to recover from exertion that each day above 20,000 feet demanded. Kancha addressed the issue directly during the next planning session. He explained that supplemental oxygen was a survival tool, not a crutch, and that even Sherpas who had spent their lives in the Khumbu used it above Camp 3 as standard practice. Cade listened with the polite detachment of someone who had already decided the advice did not apply to him. I've covered enough of these stories to recognize that look, it never ends well. He finally accepted a bottle at Camp 3 around 23,500 feet, only after his coordination on the Lhotse face deteriorated to the point where his crampon placements became visibly inconsistent. Kancha noted in his logbook that Cade's acclimatization was marginal. Oxygen saturation readings were lower than expected for his fitness level, confirmation that cardiovascular conditioning and altitude adaptation were separate biological processes. Kancha communicated his concerns to the expedition leader, who noted them but did not restrict Cade's participation. The client had paid $65,000. The commercial math was familiar and ugly. And that right there is what I keep circling back to. Someone had every reason to stop this and didn't. The summit window opened on May 18th, a narrow band of reduced wind and clear skies predicted to hold for roughly 48 hours. Cade departed base camp on May 19th, ascending through the icefall in pre-dawn darkness, reaching Camp 2 by early afternoon. He continued to Camp 3 the following morning, then pushed to Camp 4 on the South Col, arriving mid-afternoon on May 20th. The Col was a desolate, wind-blasted plateau, scattered with the debris of decades, crushed oxygen bottles, shredded tent fabric, frozen waste. The wind held steady at about 25 miles per hour. Cade forced down energy gels and broth, his appetite gone at an altitude where the body consumed itself to stay alive. From what I found, by this point, multiple people on the expedition had privately questioned whether he should be going higher. Shortly before midnight, Kancha woke him for the summit push. A second Sherpa, Sonam Dendi, 33 years old, 4 summits, would accompany them. The expedition's Western guide reinforced the turnaround time during the final briefing. If they had not reached the summit by early afternoon, they would turn around regardless of proximity. Cade acknowledged the protocol without comment. They departed Camp 4 around midnight, joining a string of headlamps stretching up the triangular face. The cold was ferocious, roughly minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. Cade climbed steadily, his strength still an asset on the steep fixed ropes. But his pace was slower than it should have been. The marginal. Acclimatization Kancha had flagged was expressing itself as reduced efficiency, each step requiring slightly more effort, each rest stop lasting slightly longer. They reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, roughly around dawn. Kancha found Cade's oxygen consumption running higher than planned and swapped in a fresh bottle. Cade showed no obvious distress, but his movements had lost the fluid confidence of lower altitudes. He sat heavily during the rest and took longer to stand when Kancha signaled to continue. His body was already giving the answer. He just wasn't listening. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet by mid-morning, where a queue had formed at the traverse leading to the Hillary Step. The bottleneck funneled dozens of climbers onto a single fixed line across a knife-edge ridge with massive exposure on both sides. Each person ahead added minutes of standing still in the death zone, burning oxygen and body heat. Cade waited with visible impatience. Kancha monitored him closely and noticed his coordination had degraded further. A gloved hand missing the rope on the first grab, a crampon placement landing slightly off its mark. The errors were not dangerous in isolation, but they indicated a nervous system operating below capacity. And you'll see why that matters in a minute. They cleared the Hillary Step roughly an hour and a half later. However, Kancha had been watching the sky. Cloud formations building to the west suggested the weather window was compressing faster than forecast. He stopped Cade on the ridge and told him directly that conditions were deteriorating and that they should turn back. Sonam supported the recommendation, gesturing toward the cloud bank thickening along the western horizon. Cade refused. He had not come this far to quit within sight of the summit. It horrified me when I read this part, but he turned and kept climbing, and believe me, it only gets worse from here. Cade Moreau reached the summit of Mount Everest just before noon on May 21st, 2023. He stood at 29,032 feet under skies that were beginning to lose their clarity, a thin haze filtering sunlight that had been sharp an hour earlier. Kancha and Sonam arrived within minutes. Trust me, what happened next consumed about 7 minutes that neither Sherpa could recover. Cade pulled out his phone, kept warm inside his down suit against his chest, and began filming. He recorded a TikTok, speaking into the camera with the summit behind him, telling his audience he had told them it would be easy. He flexed through his layers, raised both arms after unclipping his ice axe from its harness. The performance was directed at an audience thousands of miles away who would watch on screens in warm rooms. Kancha urged him to finish. Sonam pointed toward the western sky, where the cloud bank was building visibly. Cade waved them off and continued filming. Then he finally made the mistake that would cost him everything. To adjust the angle of his phone, Cade pulled off his right glove. The air temperature at the summit was approximately minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill. At the wind speeds present on the ridge, exposed skin reached frostbite threshold in under a minute. His bare hand was in the open air for roughly 45 seconds as he repositioned the phone and attempted to frame a final shot. By the time he pulled the glove back on, the damage was done. His fingers had lost all sensation, the nerve endings deadened by cold that penetrated tissue faster than circulation could compensate. For a TikTok, all of that. For a TikTok, I want you to really let that simmer. The loss of feeling became critical about 90 seconds later, when Cade began descending the summit ridge. The route required clipping and unclipping from fixed ropes at each anchor point, a mechanical process demanding functional grip and fine motor control in both hands. His left hand managed the carabiner adequately. His right hand could not close around the gate with enough pressure to operate it. He fumbled the first clip, managed the second on the third attempt, and by the fourth anchor point, his right hand had become a blunt instrument, the fingers curled but unresponsive. This is where I need you to really picture the situation. 3 feet of snow, thousands of feet of nothing on either side, and one working hand. Concha moved close to assist, reaching across the narrow ridge to clip Cade's carabiner at each transition. The terrain was severe, a snow ridge perhaps 3 feet wide, with thousands of feet of exposure on both sides. Wind had increased to close to 40 miles per hour. Cade's balance was compromised by fatigue, marginal oxygen, and the cognitive impairment that roughly 12 hours above 26,000 feet guaranteed. Everything that could go wrong was already going wrong. He just couldn't process it anymore. About half an hour into the descent, roughly 200 feet below the summit, Cade stopped to reposition. His footing where the ridge narrowed to less than 2 feet. He planted his right boot, but the placement was off, too far to the edge, crampon points engaging soft snow rather than the harder layer beneath. His weight shifted onto the compromised foot and the snow gave way. His left hand shot out and caught the fixed rope. His right hand reached simultaneously but could not close. The frozen fingers slid across the surface without gripping. His full body weight transferred to his left arm, an arm already depleted by about 13 hours of climbing and oxygen deprivation. The muscles held for roughly 2 seconds before the load exceeded what they could sustain. Concha lunged forward, dropping to his knees on the ridge, and caught Cade's left wrist just as his grip on the rope failed. Cade looked up at him and communicated the only thing his failing body could register, that he couldn't feel his hands. For a fraction of a second, Concha held him, about 200 pounds of body, and gear pulling against a man braced on a knife-edge ridge in near 40-mile-per-hour wind. And I want you to bear in mind how much of a superhuman feat that is. Concha's shoulder absorbed the shock. Something in the joint gave way. A sound Sonam later described as a dull, wet snap, audible even through the wind. Concha's left arm went slack and the grip broke. Cade Moreau fell from the summit ridge of Mount Everest moments later. Witnesses on the south summit described a dark shape tumbling down the southwest face, accelerating across hard snow and exposed rock until the mountain's geometry carried him beyond sight. He was 27 years old. The aftermath of what happens honestly breaks me even more, but Kancha Bhode was evacuated from Camp 4 by helicopter the following morning with a complete dislocation of his left shoulder and a torn rotator cuff sustained during the attempted catch. Doctors in Kathmandu determined the joint would never recover full load bearing, a capacity ending 18 years of high-altitude guiding in a single moment. Cade's body was spotted 2 days later, lodged on a rock feature roughly 2,500 feet below the ridge. Recovery was not attempted. He remained on the mountain. In the weeks that followed, Cade's TikTok account gained over 4,000 followers. Old clips resurfaced, him laughing about Everest, calling it easy, flexing in front of the icefall. Comments filled with mockery, shock, and criticism. His mother did not make a public statement, but people close to the family said she replayed that phone call constantly, the one where she told him one mistake could change everything, and he told her it would be easy. Friends repeated the same observation. He always pushed too far, and nobody could ever tell him otherwise. And based on every single climb I've covered on this channel, I can guarantee all of you that Everest is not a content opportunity. It is not a challenge designed for ego. Even strong bodies and confident minds mean nothing against a mountain that doesn't care who you are. His ego didn't just push him to the top, it made sure he would never come back.